Good morning or good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started here. We're a minute or two after the top of the hour. As folks join, they can join in progress. First of all, I hope everybody's having a good week so far. Welcome to our February webinar. For those of you who may be new to these, please feel free to go to our website. We do one of these a month. We've probably been doing them for a couple of years now. So there's a number of topics where we've done these webinars on everything from IEC 62443 and how to apply that to how to build business cases for OT security, et cetera. Today, we're specifically focusing on the notion of supply chain risks in OT, or software supply chain risks in OT, and using Log4j and the Log4Shell vulnerability as an example of that. We're going to dive into the vulnerability, et cetera, as we talk today. Just by way of introduction, I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. I've been with the company for 5 or 6 years. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years of my career with McKinsey & Company, which is a consulting firm, helping industrial organizations and technology organizations get through digital transformation efforts. Joining me today is Bill Easton. Bill is our CTO. He's been in cybersecurity for about 15 years or so, and has been the leader in developing our platform over the last 4 or 5 years. And he's going to take you through a different approach that he and our development team have developed to address the Log4j vulnerability, Log4Shell vulnerability. Just by way of background of who we are as a company. So Verve got its beginning almost 30 years ago now in the world of industrial controls engineering, basically designing control systems. And over the last 15 years or so, we've been focused more and more on securing those control systems. About 15 years ago, we built the first version of what we now call the Verve Security Center to protect industrial control systems from cyber threats. And that platform brings together a number of elements of security, both endpoint and network, to try to provide a comprehensive solution for OT security. We're going to actually talk a little bit about that today as we talk about how Bill and the team develop new ways of approaching this vulnerability that we think are very specific and helpful in the OT environment. We also provide a range of services regarding OT or ICS cybersecurity, everything from vulnerability assessments to managed security. So helping our clients over time with things just like this, of kind of ongoing managed vulnerability management, et cetera. So that's just a bit about us before we dive in. So what are we going to talk about today? So first thing we're going to do is just do a brief introduction to what is Log4j and what is Log4Shell. What are the vulnerabilities that are referred to there? What is Log4j? What is its function? Why does it exist? What are those vulnerabilities that were discovered? And then why is this such a significant threat, both in IT as well as OT environments? Secondly, then we're going to talk about mitigating Log4Shell vulnerabilities. And Bill is going to take us through some of the challenges that have been discovered by using traditional approaches to finding and fixing those vulnerabilities. And then he's going to talk about this approach that we developed that our clients have all been using to great effect in a very efficient way that's very safe for operating technology systems. Frankly, it's also very effective in IT as well. And so he'll take you through that. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about, okay, so what does this mean for the broader security question in OT? And talk a little bit about how Log4j is kind of the tip of the iceberg as it is as we talk about supply chain cyber risks. A lot of the traditional approaches we may think of air gaps and those types of things are not really very effective at addressing these supply chain software supply chain risks. And we'll talk through a little bit of our different approach to how to go at that security. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive in. So first of all, what is Log4j? So for those of you who aren't maybe developers or who don't live in the world of Apache and open source, Log4j is number 252. And so, okay, well, that's not that high, but out of 7.1 million total downloaded components on Apache. So Apache, an open source platform, and the Log4j component is, one of the very top, most popular components that's downloaded. So what does it do? It is essentially the logging component of the Apache framework. So it logs events that are happening in that software and then communicates that log and that message to the user or to others in the organization. One of the more frequent examples you may see is when you're on the web and you type a web address that doesn't return an answer, you'll get the 404 error around a bad web link. So think of this as the way software companies are allowing a logging of their application. And then it's embedded in that software. So it's an open source component that you can download and you can embed in your software. And it allows the programmer to specify custom code. So in other words, that 404 message, right? So when this happens, a log is created. That log can then be sent someplace else for further, essentially, analysis or processing that then returns a message. So it could be, in this case, the 404. It could come back with looking up a name. So you type in your a name on your login name, and then it links to your actual name, as an example. And it uses a thing called JNDI, or Java Naming and Directory Interface, to conduct this communication, right? So when that log happens, that JNDI will essentially allow this communication to go out to that other server and bring back another piece of information so that you, as the user or the analyst or whatever, can get more context to what's going on in that log message. And that uses a range of different protocols to do that. One thing that people may have heard of is this term of a jar file. And a lot of the ways that people have thought about trying to find the Log4j files that are hidden, as it were, embedded in the software program, is to look up these quote unquote jar files, which are Java archives, which essentially is, it's based on the zip format. You could think of it as basically a zip file where you're storing all of your Java components. And theoretically, if you find the jar file and you delete that, you can then, you will have addressed the vulnerability by getting rid of Log4j. The problem is you've also deleted everything else around Java in that jar file. So the basic concept here is it is a logging framework. But the unique part about this is this logging framework allows for communication outside the application itself to other applications or other servers. That's the benefit of it, but also became a bit the risk. So Log4Shell. Log4Shell is the name of the vulnerability, actually multiple vulnerabilities that were discovered within the Log4j product or component. As Jen Easterly calls it, who's the director of the US CISA, the most serious vulnerability she's seen in her lifetime. This is a really big deal. And the reason it is a big deal is because it is spread across so many devices. So number one, there's actually multiple vulnerabilities here. The most significant and the original one was one that enabled remote code execution. It was actually discovered in China by someone at Alibaba who discovered this risk. And that has a CVE score of 10. The other ones are in the 9s. And the affected versions you see here, obviously we'll send this report out. You've probably already figured out what affected versions are if you've been diving into this whole Log4j question. Just give you a sense of how widespread this is. The vulnerable versions of this software are in 8% of all Java packages. You can think of the number of Java packages that are out there. Just to give you a sense, a median for other vulnerabilities is 0.1%. So when you think of other Java vulnerabilities, they apply to 0.1% on average or in median of Java packages. This applies to 8% of them. It is very widespread. And basically, the vulnerability, if it's an affected version, they have certain features that allow an adversary to basically substitute this message, as I mentioned, that communicates outbound and then comes back in. They can basically substitute messages in that lookup, and on that return path, send pretty much anything they want into that application. And so they can create what's called a reverse shell that allows a remote server to control the device. So what does that look like? So the Swiss CERT came out with a pretty good graphic of what this is. So an attacker essentially inserts this lookup in a header field that likely is to be logged, that could be logged, and they hit that vulnerable server. And then secondly, that string is then passed into Log4j. So it then logs that string. It then queries the malicious server. So as I mentioned, that JNDI then goes out and queries another server to come back. Well, it queries, in this case, a malicious server because the attacker has inserted that different lookup path into the JNDI. And then that LDAP server then will respond with the militia Java code. And then Java downloads that and executes it automatically with no certification, no verification, et cetera. It just automatically does that. So you can think of the number of things that an attacker could put into that code. The most significant one just being access, right? So now, open access to me to be able to impact that application. Obviously, a pretty severe risk given the number of things that one could do and the number of applications that are actually vulnerable. And so as you think about this, you say, well, okay, what's required to do this? Well, the attacker's got to have access to that vulnerable server because they've got to be able to put in that message. They've got to somehow, there has to be internet access essentially to that server. Once it's in, they'd have to find an application that has Log4j in it that's vulnerable, and then this process can happen. And so one of the questions that's come up is, well, OT is different. We have air gaps. We're not connected to the internet. So the attacker in that prior page there's no internet access to a server or an HMI or anything in an OT environment. Or the second pushback has been, well, our devices are all legacy. We don't have Log4j in any of the applications that we're running. Well, that's not quite really true. So one of the things that we do for our clients, we do dozens and dozens of vulnerability assessments every year. We use our platform to pull out information to identify network risks, endpoint risks, et cetera. And the reality is these air gaps, while being potentially designed that way, in fact, don't operate that way. We've got IoT devices. The number of times we'll go in and find IoT devices put in the back of a PLC rack or a controller where that's given that vendor remote access to the device is uncountable. And then there's obviously the planned IoT initiatives. We've got remote access happening in most organizations at this point, and in many cases that remote access is not well managed. While we have firewalls, in many cases they're weak firewalls in the sense of protections in the design, but then in many cases they're designed well, but the actual implementation of that design over time starts to drift. And then in terms of the assets don't use modern open source tools. In fact, many of them do, right? We're using HMIs and servers. Someone asked in the questions beforehand, are any of the SCADA applications affected? And yes, they are. You can go to the CISA website and see it. You can go to your vendors' websites and see them. But there are many OT OEM software that is running in in an OT environment that is using this Log4j application. Obviously, if it's 30 years old, it's probably not. But a lot of the newer applications do. And so OT is not islanded, so to speak, from this risk. So what did CISA recommend that we do? Well, the first is to discover all internet-facing assets. So the first thing is go figure out where does Java, what is the Log4j Java library exist anywhere in the stack. Secondly, update or isolate those assets. So they said assume they've been exploited and begin to hunt. And then finally, monitor for odd traffic, that communication path coming in and then going back out again, to see has something been affected, and you're seeing that JNDI outbound to the internet that shouldn't be. And then there's a range of other mitigations that one could take. But at the end of the day, the first thing is, first of all, you need to understand what of your assets are internet facing. And then secondly, start to review those assets to see where Log4j is. That is the first thing to do. And then secondly, to be able to monitor for that. And so we think about, okay, how do we do that? How do we address these CISA recommendations? Our team spent a bunch of time looking at what were the options that we could use, that our clients could use to do this. And as I mentioned, developed an alternative approach using the Verve platform that addresses this in a OT safe way, but that also can be quite helpful in the IT world. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill, and he's going to take us through this second section.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. So yeah, we're going to talk about actually detecting and mitigating the Log4Shell vulnerabilities. It's a hard problem to solve. And so one of the first things we noticed when we looked at the market and looked at what other solutions were available for detecting Log4j, what we saw was a lot of sledgehammers. We saw a lot of very heavy solutions. And so we want to kind of walk through a couple of those today, as well as why they ended up using those kind of solutions before we kind of talk about why ours is different. So detecting it is hard. And you can advance the slide, John. And the issue is, again, as John mentioned, this isn't an application called Log4j. This is a dependency. So there's no software list that you can just search for Log4j. Vendors are very slow to tell you when those applications are vulnerable, the applications you may have in your software inventory. If you go to the CISA list of vulnerable applications, you'll find hundreds of them are just say in review, right? It's been a month and a half now, but somehow they're still trying to figure out if their own applications have Log4j in them. And so vendors essentially have to scan these devices. They have to build these tools which touch every file on the system in order to try to figure out if Log4j is there. A lot of the time, this traffic looks normal. It's following the normal paradigms of what the Java application might be doing. And so it can be difficult to detect unless you've tuned your anomaly detection, you've tuned your firewall, you've tuned your IDS to detect traffic like this. A lot of organizations didn't know that their applications even had this functionality in the first place in order to set up detections like this. And in the case of OT systems, running a really high impact scanner and then just killing the application and trying to fix it is not really going to work. You likely need that application running. It may be part of the productivity of the facility to have that application running, and certain automated solutions which assume that it's running on somebody's laptop and might be killing PowerPoint don't really work in these types of scenarios. So on the next slide, we've got our start of kind of a vendor solution overview. So when we started looking, we don't want to build stuff that exists in the marketplace. If there's a good market-based solution, we're going to point our customers towards that. We don't want to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. As we started looking, we got really disappointed. We were seeing scanners from major vendors consuming gigabytes of memory, doing things like opening the files in memory to scan them. And so all of a sudden you might have a 2 GB jar file that the scanner is now opening in memory, consuming all of the available memory on the system and grinding it to a halt. We also noticed that they really love using the CPU, 100% CPU usage for the duration of the scan. And that some of these scans took anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes up to 20 minutes on very fast systems. And all of the systems we used were just stock Windows Server systems with no applications, no databases. They don't have millions of files. And so, 20-minute scan time on a brand new server with super fast CPU and disk doesn't translate very well to a 10-year-old or a 7 or a 5-year-old OT system, which doesn't have a solid state drive. It has a hard drive, doesn't have 16 CPU cores, doesn't have 100 gigs of memory. And so we had a couple outliers that were particularly bad. On the next screen, we have some of the issues that we kind of found along the way. So the performance isn't the only issue. It taking 20 minutes might be manageable in some situations, but we found some pretty severe limitations, and a lot of these aren't advertised. You kind of have to figure them out as you go, and then pivot once you figure it out. The big one is that the vast majority of solutions that we looked at were 64-bit only. They would only work on a 64-bit version of Linux, a 64-bit version of Windows. Now, if you're looking at brand new systems, that may not be that big of a deal. 95% of systems today that are deployed are 64-bit. You go back 5 years ago, and that's not the same. That's not 95% anymore. It's 85%. You go back 7 years ago, and it starts to get closer to 50%. You go back 10 to 12 years ago, and it's almost all x86. And so, other scanning tools certainly help you with your modern systems that are new and fresh, but kind of leave you guessing about these older systems. They also touch every file on the system, and that's a huge impact to the system. Lots of opportunity for disk corruption, lots of opportunity to grind applications to a halt, and lots of opportunity to flag security tools, even browsers. So we actually had 3 of the different scanners that we looked at got flagged by the browser upon downloading as potentially malicious. And the irony of trying to fix a security solution by potentially creating another security problem. We certainly were a little surprised by that. These scanners would run and they would maybe report results, but they don't advertise what their capabilities are. And so a Log4j scanner has a range of capabilities for what it's able to detect and not detect. And these vendors don't publish what their scanners might miss and what they can find. And so you're left guessing, how comprehensive was that scanner? Did it find everything? Did it look in nested dependencies where, okay, I'm not using Log4j, but as John pointed out, I could be using a database library to connect to a SQL database, and that database library could be using Log4j. So I didn't even use Log4j myself. The half of the solutions opened these files in memory, consuming lots of memory on the system with no upper limit. And so for some systems, it could be fine. Other systems, it could bring down the system. A third of the solutions took more than 10 minutes to scan a fresh Windows Server installation with no applications on them. And a quarter of the solutions had dependencies that had to be installed first, whether it's Python, PowerShell core, something else that the administrator has to deploy separately in order for the scanner to actually work on that system, which really slows down your scanning and potentially has a larger impact on the system. Now you have to deploy Python, you have to keep it on during the scan, and then you either have to remove Python or you have to start patching Python. On the next slide, we go a little bit more into performance here. So we kind of separated them out into the worst and then kind of what we viewed as having at least somewhat acceptable performance. And you can see that if you were just going online and just picking a scanner, your chances of picking a bad one versus a good one are not good. You're likely to pick a bad one. Those are going to be the most popular ones. And bad versus good, we're still just talking about performance here. We haven't really talked about the difference our scanner makes, but you can see just from, I hope you can see just from this graph how much less CPU, memory, and time our scanner takes. We actually don't even call it a scanner. We call it a detector because we're not touching every file in the system. We're not heavily impacting the system kind of in our default mode. On the next screen, we kind of zoom in on that graph. So you can actually see that there is a bar there. We do take some time. And, you know, we'll get into this a little bit more, but the goal of our detector is that you don't have to worry about resources. You can deploy it across your entire facility, your entire infrastructure, without having to worry about you know, scheduling it, separating out by time, limiting impact, you know, doing 20 systems at a time. You don't have to worry about, you know, are the target machines virtualized, and how is that can impact my virtualization cluster. We're really proud of the fact that you can just take our detector, point it at 1,000 devices, and get results back, you know, almost immediately. With each device, our average runtime is 0 seconds. And so I think that's a cool stat. Virtualization is a particular challenge. You know, I know lots of these environments, especially older ones, may not have virtualization in place. But when you have virtualization, you may have 20 servers, virtual servers, that are all sharing the same underlying disk, the same underlying CPU. And so, you know, 100% CPU on one server for a scanner now impacts your other systems that are potentially critical. So it makes it much harder to say, oh, I'm just going to scan my non-critical systems. With virtualization, scanning your non-critical systems can impact your critical systems. I was going to put a nice graph of the resource utilization of ours running across hundreds of servers on a cluster, but it doesn't look like anything. There's no blip. There's no increase in utilization to show. You know, it's a flat line. And so we were really excited about watching customers run ours against 10,000 devices at once. So I've talked about our solution as this high level amorphous thing. So let's talk a little bit more about what it actually is. So we have a security platform. It allows us to, you know, report asset data. It allows us to run actions. And, you know, when we first started looking at this, we thought, okay, maybe we are going to have to scan these devices. And, you know, our solution would have allowed us to do that. But as we started looking more, we said, you know, our customers are not going to like this. They're not going to like these heavy scans. If we could come up with some better way to do this, we could really move the needle on detection for Log4j. So we started working on using our existing agent to build a discovery approach that doesn't use significant amounts of CPU or RAM. And our goal was that we could say it runs in a few seconds, and that would be the worst case, not the best case. We have logic that allows us to reduce false positives. We're focusing on things that are possibly vulnerable. So on systems that don't have any Log4j, our detector, you know, takes even less time, you know, from 0 seconds to 0 seconds. But we made the detector cross-platform. One of the things that we found when we were looking at vendor solutions is, you know, one of the solutions that was fast and low resource usage might only work on Linux. And so you might have to use one scanner on Linux, one on Windows. Maybe you have some Mac devices. You'd have to use a third one on Mac and a fourth one on Unix. So we really wanted one solution with a single reporting mechanism, a single scheduling mechanism that you could run across everything without having to worry about what OS it was. Is it x64? Is it x86? What dependencies are on those machines? And we wanted to make sure that those results could be placed in context, and that those results could then be kind of matched up to the applications. So it's great that we tell you that server A is vulnerable for Log4j, but what's the application that's vulnerable? Where is it vulnerable? What's the proof that it's vulnerable? You know, those are all things we wanted to be able to report. And with our platform, mitigation and remediation can take all sorts of different forms. It can be, you know, limiting access to the machine. It can be, you know, turning on the firewall, blocking ports. It can be removing the software. It can be updating the software. One of the things that we have access to with our platform is network and endpoint data. So we can do things like detect transient Java services, where maybe, an application downloads a Java app, runs it for 10 minutes, and then deletes it as part of a scheduled job. Those are things that traditional scanners would miss. And so we kind of mix this, one-off detection with continuous monitoring. And then finally, we use our threat feeds to identify post-exploitation events in the environment. So we'll get to that, the threat feeds and post-exploitation events in just a little bit. But I did want to show you kind of some just scan results. So our Log4j detector puts the data into our platform. So from our asset manager, from reporting, you can start to review this data and start to take action. We show exactly where that file, exactly where the vulnerable binary is, regardless of whether it's bundled in a dependency, part of the application. We're unique in our support for Kubernetes and Docker containers. Now, you may not be running Kubernetes and Docker directly, but Kubernetes and Docker are very popular ways for vendors to ship you applications. So you may have an application from a vendor which has Docker embedded, and Docker kind of changes the game for dependencies. It makes it much more difficult to identify them. And so lots of scanners just kind of pretend Docker doesn't exist. And so you've got these services that are vulnerable on the machines. John was talking a little bit before about air gaps, challenges with network segmentation. We talked to a lot of customers who came to us and said, well, I ran a scanner and it didn't show anything, or it showed a couple of things, but I have network segmentation in place. And so what we find is that when a customer says there's no traffic allowed, when they say they have firewalls in place, there's no remote access, what we find is that was probably true at one point. There was a point in time where that was true. But over the course of several years, you have configuration rot, you have missing documentation, you have introduction of new systems, and not everyone may be aware of how all of those systems fit together in the facility. And so it's part of the reason we focus on defense in depth. We're not just telling you, a detector is the solution and then you can go on with your day. A detector only works if you know all of your devices, if you're managing all of your devices. So we focus on what devices are not managed that you need to go look at, and then you can run a detector against. We focus on, where is Log4j? What systems have Log4j? Has anything novel talked to those systems recently? Have those systems talked to anything else recently? And we provide automation for these activities with our threat feeds. But we also enable an operator to do this detection themselves. So if you hear about a new threat, if you hear about a certain type of attack, if you want to be sure that there haven't been any LDAP queries, we allow you to do that within the platform. So it's not this black box of saying, here's where you're vulnerable and here's where you're not. We can also do that manual investigation if needed. So manual investigation is a lot of fun. I spend a lot of my time doing investigations, but asking hundreds of organizations all to look for the same command and control servers, the same pieces of malware, isn't a good use of anyone's time. A lot of the time, attackers using Log4j use Log4j to gain remote access to a corporate or an OT network to then launch other attacks. And a lot of the time that comes in the form of a botnet or placement of malware. Botnets have command and control servers. And so we're always monitoring the latest command and control threats. And we publish a threat feed to our customers of active command and control servers. And this allows you to kind of have that safety net of knowing, that if there is a publicly known command and control server, I don't necessarily have to log in to Verve to go, do a manual investigation. I'll get an alert if any of my systems start talking to one of those command and control servers. Not only do we do that in an automated fashion, but our tools make it very easy for you to do that yourself. So if you notice, malicious activity on a system, it's talking to some foreign server, we make it very easy for you to plug in that server and figure out what else has been talking to it, across your network. And this can help inform kind of additional investigations Now, the heart of it should be our automated threat feeds. Those are updated daily with the latest threats. But again, if there's something outside of that that you need to do the investigation, we want to be able to empower you to do that. On the next slide, we start talking about malware samples. So one of the things that we also do, in addition to command and control threat feeds, is we have malware threat feeds. Malware threat feeds aren't necessarily intended to replace antivirus. They're really meant to augment your antivirus. Attackers use existing malware kits for these. They didn't build all new malware to put on systems with the Log4j. They just used the Log4j vulnerability to install existing and relatively similar malware to what already exists. In late December, we started tracking several malware families as well as ransomware families that were starting to use Log4j. And so what we can do is your traditional antivirus solution is signature based. And those updates may come out, once a day, once a week, several times a day. But they tend to lag behind the latest threats. And so what our malware threat feed does is it really focuses on 0-day threats, malicious samples that have just come out in the last couple of hours that are not currently detected by antivirus solutions. And so we kind of act as that buffer in your environment that gives your antivirus time to catch up, to give you time to distribute those antivirus definitions. And we kind of merge those together. We kind of fuse those sources together. So here's an example of, a day before your malware solution detected, an infection on a system, our threat feed actually detected that same sample, a full day before the malware scan picked it up. And so those two things can work together, where maybe something's not in our threat feed, but it's in your antivirus tool. Maybe something is in our threat feed, but not in your antivirus tool, to kind of act as that extra layer of detection for things like this, which are kind of brand new threats that are escalating quickly. And so our tools help kind of provide that extra layer of detection. I think you're muted, John.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. And I'm also getting a lot of sun in my window here, so I'm a little bit blinded. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Just to quickly summarize what Bill said, is basically the concept here is to take an approach that can work on essentially any type of device, whether that be a Linux device, a Windows device, no matter how old it is, no matter whether it's in an operating environment that requires, 5 nines uptime, and to be able to still find those vulnerabilities on that device. And then to marry that with the detection mechanisms of traffic and malware that may be moving in and out of the system. And to bring those two pieces together so that you have a single view of how to, of where this vulnerability may exist and what you can do about it. And that's sort of a foundation of what we think is going to be necessary as we go into the future of these OT security, or broadly security risks, right? So Log4j is the tip of the iceberg. We are seeing an increasing number of these software supply chain risks. SolarWinds, an example, but that's just, one component. A lot of, particularly in the OT environment, a lot of the products are built on a stack, right? And that stack is often, made up of open source components. If you look at the vulnerabilities, the ICS cert vulnerabilities, a majority of those are based on the stack that the ultimate software is running. And so the need to dive inside those files to understand what's underneath is going to be a key part of how we protect our systems. And similarly, we're going to need to take a defense in depth approach, because there's not going to be one mitigating, one remediation path that we can take in OT. We're going to have to think about a broader set of approaches, right? I mean, manufacturing is in the crosshairs, right? Manufacturing and energy have jumped to being the top, 2 of the top 3 targeted types of organizations. And the number of ICS vulnerabilities is only growing. And so as we think about that landscape, CISA has published their defense in depth guidance. And yes, it's high level. Yes, it's, kind of a simplified version of what you need to do. But the concept of we need to think about layers, right? We can't just say, all right, our only answer is patching. Well, no, you're not going to be able to patch some of these systems in OT. Or the alternative, well, we've got a perimeter network. We don't need to worry about anything inside because we're air gapped, or we've got strong firewalls, et cetera. Well, as we've said earlier in this presentation, those perimeter securities often fade over time as new devices are connected, as new rules are put in place, et cetera. And so our strong view is we need to bring these pieces together. We need to provide essentially that defense in depth, but in a way that simplifies all the complexity of these different layers. There have essentially historically been kind of three broad options of how to do this in OT. There's been the OEM specific tools, most of which are sort of built off of some white labeled IT tool, right? So they'll aggregate a McAfee SIM, SolarWinds, combine that with Nessus, and they've got a security solution. And most of them will focus specifically on one OEM system. So the ABB systems or the GE systems, rather than providing essentially a vendor agnostic. So you end up with sort of a patchwork of security tools if you've got multiple vendors. The second approach has been the passive network traffic analysis. So we'll try to deploy spans and taps, and we'll monitor network traffic through those spans and tap ports, or taps and span ports. And then we'll try and infer the endpoint information based on the traffic. But they're only able to see what's on the wire. And so therefore, things like Log4j, you would never be able to see all of the embedded software, all of the jar files, et cetera, that are sitting inside there. You would be dependent on purely the network traffic analysis to know if the Log4j vulnerability existed. And then finally, there's the IT tools. And I think we've talked a lot about that today. The challenges with many of those tools from a scanning point of view. We talked about Log4j, but frankly, running a vulnerability scanner in an OT environment is a pretty risky thing to do. So our view is we need an alternative approach to this. The Log4j approach that Bill talked about kind of is an example of how that approach can come to life and make a real difference on a very particular vulnerability. But it has to be safe for OT. It has to do exactly what Bill's chart showed in terms of not running up CPU usage when we want to understand vulnerabilities. It has to be vendor agnostic. We can't have it only work on certain of the equipment. It has to be endpoint focused rather than just network, because that's where these vulnerabilities exist. They're existing in the endpoints. Depth of view, et cetera. And so, the network based approach, from the traffic, you can only gather a certain amount of information, right? It's a Windows box, but, what is on it? What software is there? What patches have been deployed? What policies are on it? Maybe there's Log4j, 3 levels deep that would never, ever be seen on the wire. And so we believe we got to get past that, and we got to get to the endpoint. And so, our view is you've got to really have that comprehensive view of the asset. You've got to obviously get asset inventory. You can't do this without asset inventory, but that asset inventory has to be robust enough to allow you to do things like we just showed with Log4j, with vulnerabilities. It has to be able to actually see patches that have been deployed and then actually deploy the patch, right? It's helpful to know that you have a risk, but eventually somebody has to do something about that. And so, as Bill mentioned, with the platform and the endpoint focus, we can then go in and actually fix things, right? We can patch them. We can harden a configuration, right? We know the full running config on that device. So if necessary, we can make changes. We can close ports and services. We can turn on firewalls, et cetera. Similarly, on user accounts, many of these threats and attacks come through particular user accounts. Well, where are those user accounts? Are they dormant on certain devices, not being used, but maybe a risk? Can we shut those off et cetera. And so we believe the platform has to enable those types of things. Bill's example of the malware piece was key. We got to be able to get threat feeds in here to be able to identify new malware that's in your system. You know, most of our clients, if they've got AV, those AV systems are not updated all the time. Many cases they're air gapped, or at least they're believed to be air gapped. And so those AV signatures may be a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year old when we do our assessment. So we got to get that updated threat feeds. We've got to be able to do intrusion detection, right? Link the endpoint with the intrusions that are coming in so we can see those interactions. And then finally, we need to be able to respond and be able to when something happens, we need to be able to go and fix it. And so our whole mission has been, this Log4j thing is just one example of what we're starting to see. And our mission has been, let's solve that underlying problem with this defense in depth kind of approach that's specifically safe and effective in OT. So as I mentioned, that concept really needs to bring all of this information together. It needs to bring your hardware and software inventory, the published vulnerabilities, the ability to do things like we've done with Log4j to identify those vulnerabilities in a way that's safe and effective, and on around this circle, right? But then also importantly, to take the actions. So once we know that inventory, we know those risks, we then need to be able to move over and solve it. And the only way you can do that is with a toolkit that allows you to take action safely and effectively in the OT environment. This is a patch example where we've identified a vulnerability, and the software can then allow you to review those patches, approve them, and then safely patch those devices when appropriate. We need to be able to integrate those vulnerability views across all of your environment, whether that be by geography or plant in this case, or by OEM system, et cetera. And obviously, if Log4j were one of these, we would see that vulnerability percolate up as a critical vulnerability that needs to be addressed. But the idea that, you know, we're going to have this limited to either, oh, okay, I can see the vulnerabilities at this plant, or I can see the vulnerabilities at this plant for this particular OEM, but I can't see that and how it relates to everything else, just won't be scalable in a world of more and more of these Log4j type of vulnerabilities. And then similarly, we need to be able to help prioritize. Most of the situations we go into, you know, a plant may have thousands of critical vulnerabilities because there's not been an active patching program. And then when we do a Log4j scan, there'll be hundreds more. And so we have to help prioritize that the platform has to be able to help you, the client, address these in a prioritized way. Which ones are the ones that are most critical? And let's go after resolving those. And then, as Bill mentioned on the detection side, you need to have this combination of telemetry to really be able to identify these threats, right? We need to be able to see syslog, net flows. We need to be able to see changes to configurations as someone made an inappropriate configuration change. We need to be able to actually monitor the device metrics. So are we seeing spikes in CPU usage or other types of behavioral changes on the devices? Obviously, Windows log data, application log data, endpoint detection logs from AV tools, et cetera. Process alarms, right? So we have this advantage in OT if we have process data. So we can actually see the physical alarms and and obviously DPI, NIDS type information, all of that then can come into a detection layer where, as Bill showed, we can put in those updated signatures and updated threat feeds that allow us to automate the process of finding these types of threats like Log4j. And there'll be another one, you know, in the next month, right? Where there'll be some new threat where we have to make sure we've got that detection rule available based on threat feeds so that our clients are up to date on those risks that are coming in. But all of that needs to work together rather than being separate pieces, at least in our view. And then lastly, we need to have a way that this approach can be what we call think global and act local, meaning the ability to get that data up centrally so that we can have a small a team of skilled resources be analyzing those risks, looking at the Log4j vulnerabilities. Okay, where are they? What do we do about them? Planning the remediation steps, building the playbooks on remediation. But then when we go to take action, we need to recognize these are OT systems. There's a process behind, there's a physical process running. And what we don't want is to have somebody at corporate, 5,000 miles away, decide to patch your turbine during operations. And so the architecture needs to allow for local controlled actions, meaning we can build a playbook, essentially we can distribute those. But before that automation happens, the local team who understands that process needs to be in the game. And so while we could, we've talked a lot about our analytic capabilities today and what needs to be done to identify something like Log4j, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that process keeps running. And so those remediation actions we're going to take have to be controllable locally. And that's obviously going to require a different architecture. We won't go through, this isn't meant to be as much of a description of Verve, but whatever platform you're going to take is going to have to get to that endpoint, right? Our approach uses these multiple layers where we've got reporting, we've got an asset manager at the sites, and then we've got a combination of agent and agentless capabilities at the endpoint. But it's going to have to get to those endpoints, right? We're going to have to find a way to be able to interact with those endpoints in a safe way, OT safe way, but that allows us to do things like what Bill described earlier. And then obviously that what we call OTSM or OT security management platform needs to fit into your IT security management, right? We don't want to create a world where there's two different competing elements. When you're doing Log4j work, you don't want to have, oh, here's my OT information, and then here's my IT information. We need to allow that integration back and forth so we can bring data into the OT platform that's relevant. So for instance, OEM vendor patch lists or backup data on these systems or antivirus data. And then similarly, we need to allow integrations outbound to an enterprise SIM or a ServiceNow or Remedy or other CMDB type applications. And so as we go about solving these, we've spent a lot of time talking about the guts of how do we go find and identify Log4j, but that has to sit within the broader context of how do I secure the overall environment? How does that fit with the other risks that we're looking at? And so in summary, Log4j is a significant threat. It's a threat to both IT and OT, and it's just one example, unfortunately, of a growing threat of these software supply chain risks. Traditional scanners, as Bill showed, have significant deficiencies. And so we built this alternative approach, and we've used Log4j to kind of give you an example of how does our approach allow you to find things like Log4j and protect yourself from Log4j in an OT specific and an OT safe way by combining our detector with that threat intelligence and monitoring for malware and for malicious communication. And then more broadly, we think that this approach of OT security management, where we're both bringing all that information together, both the endpoint network detections, et cetera, together, as well as the ability to have OT safe actions at the endpoint layer is the only way really to enable efficient OT security in a world of growing software supply chain and other risks. So with that, we'll draw to a close. There were a few questions that came in beforehand, and so we'll try and address a couple of those. And then if there's other questions, please do put them in the Q&A. So one of the questions was, is automated vulnerability scanning missing some of the old threats? I think we showed there's some significant risk to automated vulnerability scanning just in the current new threats. Does it miss some of the old threats? It could. I actually think the vulnerability scanners are probably pretty good at picking up old risks. The biggest issue with vulnerability scanners in OT, as probably most of you know, is is the risk of scanning a device that shouldn't be scanned, right? I mean, if you scan a PLC, you're just as likely to knock it offline as to get any security information from it. One of the other questions was, do any of the common SCADA packages use Log4j? Yes, they do. And if you go to the CISA website, there's a link to the GitHub that shows all of the software that has been identified. As Bill said earlier, unfortunately, that list is in progress, we'll call it, meaning a lot of the items are not quite clear whether they are vulnerable yet. And there are a ton of products that aren't listed on that CISA that we have strong beliefs have Log4j in them. But it's a starting point, right? It's a starting point that you can look at, and you can look up your vendors on there and see what their current status is. And there was a question around how do you know if Apache or Log4j is in your environment. I think we've showed that. One of the other questions that came out, which wasn't specific about Log4j, but more broad, was, okay, we're a refinery and we've got a relatively limited budget. Where do we begin? Where do we begin this journey? And so our view on this is that the first place to start is with the ability to respond to a threat. So everybody says, oh, we'll start with segmentation. Yeah? It'd be great if you could, but in most cases, segmentation can take quite a while, and you don't really know what you're trying to segment because you don't know your assets, you don't know the connections, you don't know what should be talking to what. And so our view is the first place to begin this is with a clear view of your assets and your connectivity today. The ability to, if something happens, to know what you've got and what needs to communicate and what doesn't. Obviously, that sounds defensive or late stage, right? Oh, I've already been impacted. I'm just doing incident response. But if you said, where would you start with the least resources? That would be one place to begin. And then adding on things like, okay, once I know that, I can now start to think about how is the best way of protecting that. It might be segmentation in certain cases. It may be just, shutting down access to certain users on devices. There's a variety of ways, but the first thing to do is to understand your situation and with an asset inventory and connectivity inventory that allows you to respond in case of an emergency. Anyway, so those are some of the questions. We welcome more. If folks have inquiries, please drop me a note. And we thank you for joining us today on our February webinar. And we'll look forward to future conversations and future webinars. So again, thanks for joining us and have a great day.